How are you? Good. The horror show was a good party.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I said we'd start at 6 o'clock, and we're going to start at 6 o'clock. My only hope is that the superintendent pulls himself loose by the time I get to his slide. So he's not even paying any attention to him. Again, my name is Jim Freeman, and you have invited me to come help walk you through a process for looking at your budget and helping the staff here develop a budget in some challenging times that may get even more challenging. I would indicate to you this evening that this evening's meeting is being live streamed, so whenever we talk or whenever we have you speak, we need to get a mic in front of you. Your new superintendent, Dr. Logan, is listening and watching, so she's just trying to get her feet on the ground to see what you fine folks can do here. I would ask, too, one thing, this is kind of, well, yeah, it's nitpicky for me, but your name tents, once you've sat down at your place, turn your name tent around so that other people can see who you are. So, and you know, at least, you know, point it out anyway, so we'll get that way. Okay. So we're going to do just a little bit of review. How come I don't work here? Oh, never mind. On. Off. There we go. All right. I'm going to run through some things very quickly. Again, our rules and norms. We're going to start and end on time. Cell phones on vibrate. 1 10-minute break. The norms are listed up here. They're also on these little tents and to help remind us of how we're going to behave and treat one another. I would add to that when we get into some discussions and dialogue about things, I would appreciate it, and I know everybody else would too, if we don't get any soapboxing or political speeches. Make your point. We'll ask if everybody's understanding, and then we'll move on. We'll have time to come back and talk through things and do some things, but we've got a lot to cover tonight. So the first part of this is going to be kind of the get and go. We're going to throw a lot of things at you, try and get through some things. Then towards the end of this, we'll hopefully have some time to do some real processing of the data and everything you've seen and ask some questions. So we're going to try and push ahead with it. With that being said, there we go. Mr. Evans.
We have multiple mics. I think we have multiple mics around here. You've got one too? Okay. Oh, just the two. Okay. Again, because, and I presume she can see us. Dr. Logan, I presume you're on the web, so she's watching as well, which, by the way, I want to thank her for being willing to give up her evening to kind of get an understanding for some of the challenges that we have. And today we're going to talk about some of those. Again, that's why we're here. Is we're coming up with approximately $15.8 million in recommendations to the school board to meet our pension obligation. So that's the task of this group this year. Now, I'll just remind you, I think this is an ongoing committee. I think we're going to see this group coming back together next year. I can see this group being annually asked to come back. So some of the learning that we're doing on, and today we've got a lot on how we generate revenue, how we expend revenue. Some of that learning that you'll have exposure to today, that's why we want you to come back next year, because we won't have to go through some of that again year after year if we can keep some of our same committee members. So that's why we're here, is to come up with really thoughtful, analytical decisions on where to capture this $15.8 million so that our school board then knows that we looked at all the potential areas where it would have the least amount of impact on our student success. And our student success, of course, the strategic plan kind of tonight it guides and really provides that impetus on where we're trying to go. And we've all seen those pieces of it. We've all seen, and we talked about the guiding principles. I know Mr. Bigsby had questions on the guiding principles last week, so we appreciate him keeping us on task on that. So just review of that again. Next thing. It's up to you. On those guiding principles, before I hand this to Jim, just real quick, next year will be the 5th year, and so my guess is we'll be doing a review and another analysis on the strategic plan, so I'd be prepared to assist and support that if possible for all of you in the room. So with that, Jim?
At the last meeting, we did some processing, and I asked you to generate some things that you thought the district needs to know as they're building a budget. And so these two are the lists of things that you came up with. And I will tell you that we're going to talk about some of these things tonight, and then we'll dig deeper into some of these things as we move forward. But you're going to hear some things about our student population tonight. You're going to hear some things about our revenue stream, revenue sources, our enrollment. The prior year expenditures is trend data, and that's in your notebook, which I'll talk about what should be in your notebook in just a little bit. And some of the other things, but we're going to start touching on some of these things because you hit the nail right on the head in terms of some of the things that we need to know. This is not a complete list. We're going to have to know other things too. But this is a kind of the basic start for everything. The notebook that you have, you were handed a whole bunch of stuff today. We're going to keep putting things into that notebook. This is what should be in that notebook at this point in time. List of the committee members, 17-18 budget at a glance, 16-17 and 17-18 general fund summaries. And those documents are things that they produce and is public information out on the website and stuff all the time, okay? 16-17 report card for schools, that's also public information out on the website. It gives a profile of all the buildings. It's kind of helpful for you to, if you want to look and see what some of the buildings are like. The one thing that's in here that starts to get into some of the higher level of detail that goes along with the budget is a report that compares the budget for each particular line item, I'll call it, compared to how much they actually spent, over or under. That's why it's called a variance report. For 3 years, 13, 14, 15, and 16. So this will be some of the data and things that we'll be looking back on on the trend data. And then, of course, the PowerPoint presentation for this for tonight. And how many of you would like to have the PowerPoint emailed out to you? Anybody would like to have it? Okay. All right, we'll try and get that sent out as well. Okay. All right. Budget overview. Connie is going to kind of take this part over because it's her budget.
Okay, the total budget for the school district for everything, that's all of our funds, the building fund, the federal funds, nutrition services, everything, is $929 million. So our total budget is approved by the Board of Education every year when we adopt our budget in the fall. Our general fund budget, which is all of our operations for all the buildings and the salary of the staff and everything, is $608 million. And with that $608 million, we're educating 52,000 students, and we make allocations or reallocations within the general fund. So
I'm going to jump in here.
Okay.
Everybody talks about cutting the budget. But when you look at it, we're not going to cut this number or the 929. That's not going to get lower. So we're not cutting total budgets. But within that budget, we're going to reallocate money from one place to another to address the needs that we have. So an individual line item in a budget will get cut, and another line item in a budget will get increased. So we're going to cut the HR budget and give it to technology. So Charles is going to be really upset with Rob. Right, Charles? Yeah. So we talk about cutting and that sort of thing, but from a total public viewpoint, we're not cutting the total budget, but we're moving money or budget authority within that budget to be able to address the needs that we have. Yes, sir.
Are we talking about decrease in, excuse me, are we talking about decrease in funding, though?
Well, we'll get into that. He's talking about the state aid reduction, okay? There may be some of that, okay? But, so this may come down, but it's going to come down because we've lost the revenue, okay? We didn't cut it, the state did, okay? Yeah. Any other questions?
Well, for example, we have to come up with $15.8 million. So instead of spending that money maybe on transportation, we're going to reduce transportation and move it over to paying for the ARC that we have to do for retirement. So we're still spending the same amount of money, we're just moving around what we're going to spend it on. Okay. So this is our total budget, the $928 million. $510 million, or 55%, the majority of that comes from local sources. And then $334 million comes from state sources, and then $85 million comes from federal sources. So the $510 million is predominantly raised by property taxes. And we receive the majority of our property taxes 2 times a year. We receive it in April and August. So that includes $280 million in bond payments that we have for special building funds, qualified capital purpose funds, which legally we can't use for anything else. So that $280 million of the $510 is restricted. We can't use it for anything else. So only $230 million of all those local revenues can be used for operations. So the $334 million we get from the state, the majority of that is raised through sales and income taxes, and that includes special education, apportionment. It funds our transportation, our regular education, ELL programs, poverty programs. So of the $334 million, $288 million of that is from state aid. And $46 million comes from other revenue sources.
Do you want to mention the formula, the TIOSA formula, and how they distribute that money?
I can. We have that later on in the program too, but that $288 million is calculated by the state, and they use a formula that's needs minus resources is your equalization aid. The state aid formula also includes things like the poverty allowance, the ELL allowance. We get special program allowance, that's for special education programs, distance ed. Those are the main ones that I can think of. So that makes up our needs, and it's based on how many students we have and a basic cost per student. So they calculate the needs, and then they figure out what our resources are, what we can raise locally, and that's mostly property taxes. And then it also is net option funding when we have students coming in from other districts. If we have more coming in than going out, we get net option funding. And then we also get income tax, which is a percentage of all the taxes that are paid in the OPS district. So on our federal revenue, that includes nutrition services, breakfast and lunch programs. And the thing about our nutrition services program, in some school districts, the general fund supports the lunch fund. In our school district, it supports itself. And in addition to that, it pays our general fund $1.7 million in indirect cost, which helps us offset the cost of cleaning up the cafeterias and all the things that go with maintaining a lunch program. So we get money for the lunch program, special education, and title funds. And then I'm listing here what we received in 16-17, just to give you an example of what federal funds we have. Now, the thing about federal funds that you have to keep in mind is we have to spend the money first, then we get reimbursed. So it's not like they give us a check for $85 million and then we spend it. We have to spend it first, then we get reimbursed. And we have funding for Title I, for class size reduction, for special education, migrant, homeless, and all of those things. And I don't know if you've been following President Trump and some of the things that he's proposing in his budget, but there is proposals to cut federal funding. So remember, our three sources of revenue are state, local, and federal. If the state goes down, federal goes down, then we don't have a way to make that up with property tax because we're limited on how much we can raise in property taxes by the state, and it's a maximum levy for our general fund of $1.05 per $100 of valuation. We can raise money for our bond payments, but we're limited in how much we can raise in general funds.
And there's restrictions on all the federal programs, exactly what you can spend it on?
Yes, all of our federal excuse me, all of our federal programs are restricted. They can only be used for what they were distributed for.
And one of the things too, we'll hit this later on in the presentation, you see Title II sitting there at $3 million. You're losing $2 million of that next year. So you're going to have to make that, that's one of the challenges that you're going to get to face. So the last meeting we also talked about when we're developing budgets, everything is based on guesses, estimates, projections, okay? So you look at this federal money, this is what we're looking at right now. Who can, Mark or someone else in here, can you tell me how soon you'll know when next year's federal funds are allocated? So we don't have any idea what, okay, sometime in the spring, if they get around to it.
They usually tell us to. So with our Title I funds, they usually tell us to count on cuts. And so what we do is try to make a prediction. So we take this year's amount, which was 28 million, but then they tell us plan on a budget for 5% cut, 10% cut, and sometimes all the way up to a 20% cut.
And I would indicate too that one of the reasons why federal money is a reimbursement is because federal money is supposed to be put on top of everything else you do, particularly on the title side of it, okay? But you hire a lot of teachers with that $3 million or that $24 million.
One more thing is just a reminder that Title I used to operate under No Child Left Behind, and now we're operating under ESSA, so all the rules have changed. And so that's another thing we have to take into consideration. And one of the biggest ones that we're working with right now with the state, who's then working with the federal government, is the use of money that can be used for professional development. And how can that money be utilized, because it's one of the exceptions. So we're hoping they're going to give us some latitude as far as how that money can be used. And hopefully it can be used for staff that would provide professional development to our teachers.
Jim, I also want to point out Title II funds for this fiscal year have not been released yet. We completed our application in the fall, we still don't have those funds.
Are we having fun yet? You can go on, Connie. I could talk about this for a long time. Keep going.
Okay, so of the
Click a couple more times. There you go. Oops, back up one.
Of the total 928 million, all of the money the district receives, 423 million of it is restricted. And it's restricted because of the bond fund, the building fund, all of our federal funds, special education, all of those things are restricted. So then what we have to work with out of the 928 is 505 million. And that 505 million is made up mostly of property tax and state aid. Or actually, it's all made up of property tax and state aid. So when you look at our general fund, which is where we do all of our operations, it's our main fund for operating the district, that's 608 million, and then this graph shows you how we spend it. So if you look at this blue right here, the 466 million, that's school support and instruction. Then the orange is transportation. It's 6.58% of our total, 608 million. Buildings and grounds is 9.3% of that total. Business support services, that's like the accounting office, the payroll office, purchasing, all of the main functions of the district, that's 5.67%. And then the Board of Education and General Administration of the $608 million is 1.84%. So when we look at restricted and non-restricted in our general fund, we have 104 million, 17% of our general fund is restricted. We can't use it on anything else. And that includes special education and our fixed costs. Our fixed costs are the lights, the heating, just running a building, operating the whole school district. Those are fixed costs. So if we wanted to reduce a budget, we couldn't go to fixed costs because they are what they are. And then our unrestricted in the general fund is $505 million. So just to give you an idea of what happens for the school district, this is showing you graphically for last year. This is our revenue stream. So if you look at the blue line, that's when our revenues come in. And then the orange line is what our expenses are. So you can see we trend about $43 million a month is what we're spending every month for the school district to operate the district. But our revenues, most of the time, are less than what we're spending. So we have to maintain a cash balance or a fund balance. Our fund balance is about 20% of our general fund budget. So right now it's like $117 million. But the reason we do that is because of those months when we don't get enough revenue in to cover our expenses. So you need a cash balance so that you're not going in the red or having to borrow money or something like that. And that's just because of the cash flows that we get throughout the year.
What's the state requirement for that cash balance? I know there's a statute on that.
I think it's 50% of the budget of, you can't have more than 50% of the budget of expenditures. But for our district, we have enough in our cash balance to last us 2 months. If we didn't get revenue from any other source, we'd only make it for 2 months before we would have to borrow money or do something different.
Okay, pause for just a second. Some of this information we just presented, stick in the back of your mind, and when we get down to the end of our meeting today and we're having some discussions, if there's more of this that you want information on, we fully expect that we will be presenting a lot more detailed information on this data. Okay, but we just wanted to give you kind of an overview so you know kind of where we are. So kind of make some marks or whatever on your sheet so you know what we're going to come back to if we need to. So for what you've seen up to this point, do you have any questions that we need to try and address right now? Okay.
So there are a number.
I want to comment here. Sorry.
That's okay.
I want you to understand that what you're going to see now is what Connie and her staff and Mark do every year to try and balance the budget. Okay? This is not something new. All right? The fact that you are gathered here now is because the challenges of making what you're going to see here happen are getting more difficult. So this is not a first time that this has happened. This goes on every year. So
we have to balance the budget every year because what we do is we get from all of the departments and all the buildings what they would like to spend, and then we figure out how much we think we're going to get because we don't know that for sure. We're estimating, like we've said before, that we're working on estimates all the time when we're preparing the budget. So we have to have a balanced budget by statute, so our needs have to equal our resources. So sometimes some of the wants are not met because we have only so much money. We can't spend more than what we have. So we move things around when we're developing the budget. So some of the things we've done in the past, just this last year with the student assignment plan, we're estimating we're going to save about $6.25 million in transportation because of the student assignment plan. We also eliminated unfilled positions here in central office. And then in addition to that, we have staffing conferences every year with the buildings to figure out, how many kids you think you're going to get, what are you going to need for your building. Sometimes we move staff around, sometimes, things are done within the buildings just to try to manage everything. Sometimes we can't hire the staff we need to hire, so we do some other things to try to balance the budget. One of the big things that we did a couple of years ago, and we continue to do that, is we get $85 million in federal funds. We can charge indirect cost to a federal fund. Right now, it's 18% of what we receive you can charge to a federal fund. Some funds you can't charge anything, but when we can, we charge as much as we can to indirect cost. What happens is that comes back into the general fund, and we can use it to help pay for some of the expenses that we have with our programs.
Does everybody understand what we mean by an indirect cost? Is anybody that needs an explanation of what? Good. Keep going.
Another thing we did,
All right. Well, anything that the general fund pays for to hire those teachers, okay? There's HR costs, there's training costs, there's equipment costs. Well, sometimes equipment comes from title, but typically what the general fund requires has to pay for to support the federal money is an indirect cost. Payroll costs, accounts payable costs, those types of things. So they figured on a percentage, and the district doesn't figure the percentage. Is it done by the state here?
Some by the state.
The state calculates that indirect cost rate every year, and does yours change?
Every year.
Every year. So again, we're guessing at what next year's indirect cost rate is going to be. Okay, but that money is legitimately comes from the general fund to pay for those services to help support the title funds.
Now, sometimes people will say, you can come up with $15 million. Why don't you just cut one of your programs? You don't need to do that. For example, we get money for our ELL programs. That's a federal source of revenue. We have to use it for the ELL program. So we can't just say, we don't need that program, let's just not do it and we'll save all that money. We can't, because we're limited in what we can do with our revenues in that regard. So there are programs that are, that we apply for a grant, we get the grant. If it's a federal grant, it has to be used for what it is applied for. Okay, other things that we've done is last year, to balance the budget, we delayed technology purchases for $2 million. We also delayed some textbook adoptions. We got that for $1.5 million. So we were trying to come up with money to balance all of the needs of the buildings and the central office with what the revenues are. So I'm getting revenue from indirect costs from the federal programs. Then I can get it from reducing our expenses in areas like we did with technology and textbook adoption. And then we also had to dip into our cash reserve to meet all of our needs last year. Last year, we had to pay $12.8 million for an ARC payment for additional retirement contributions. If we had not had to have done that, we could have balanced the budget and maybe done something more, but we had to come up with money to do that. So $9.4 million of that was in our cash reserve. Now, you remember the slide when we talked about our revenues and our expenses and the flow that we have? So we have to keep a cash balance to make sure we can cover all of our expenses. When we dip into our cash balance, that means when our revenues dip, we're not going to have enough money, maybe, to cover what our expenses are. So we have to maintain a cash balance so that we can still operate because of the fluctuations we have in state and federal revenues.
Any questions? Okay, the next part we're going to talk about, there's a couple of slides in here that we're going to look at a little bit of trend data, and then I'm going to ask Rob to talk a little bit about technology. On the last slide, you saw we held back on some technology purchases. So he's going to give you some information about the technology program and where it is, and he's got kind of a timeline on what that means, what those kind of budget cuts mean. And then later on, we're going to have Melissa talk a little bit about the textbook adoption piece of it too. So again, just trying to provide you information on what happens and where these programs are in terms of what their needs are. And I would indicate to you that you can kick the can down the road on either one of these two areas, curriculum or technology, and get by for a little bit. But after a while, you get to where you're so far behind that it's almost impossible to catch up. So, that being said, first trend tech, Mr. Evans, you want to talk about?
Growing district. Yeah, this just gives you a quick glimpse of a good news story for our district, actually one of the better news stories for urban districts across America. You can see the trend chart for growth in official membership, which is outstanding, and we like that challenge. Part of that challenge is, and this is something we have talked about at the school board table, in fact, they just voted 9-0 to support a bond project that's going to have a resolution for the next board meeting because this has caused overcrowded schools. Because we've got a growth chart, as you can see, that over the last 10 years, we're up, over 10,000 students. Last year it was 800 students. Kind of an interesting fact on that, we do gain additional resources with the growth of student population. Each student brings with them a state formula that does give us additional dollars to fund that student. But some of our students come to us with some extra special needs, I guess you might say. A large percentage are ELL students. You didn't like the box?
Your successor can't hear you.
Oh, okay. She can't? Oh, really? I thought they could. Okay. We have a large percentage of this population growth that is ELL. And so we do have some extra needs that come with ELL. We do get some additional dollars to help with the English language learners. That's what ELL is, English language learners. But probably not as much as the staffing that we put in schools. So it's one of those challenges. But a good challenge to have a growing district, one that we're anticipating between 500 to 800 new students a year based on that trend pattern. That seems to be the approximate range that we're looking at. Total FTE per building?
Are those pre-K students?
I don't have that number off the top of my head, Robert. That's a good question. It's not really super high. Scott, in research, we'll check on that, unless you know off the top of your head. Total 2,800 students in pre-K, but as far as growth year to year, it's pretty static, I believe. So, because it takes new funding to add on, and we've been able to add on a little bit through the learning community, pretty minimal, but about 2,500, 2,800 pre-K kids. Good question. Building enrollment just follows along that student enrollment. If your student enrollment goes up, you're going to have more FTE because you're going to have more teachers, more staff in the office, more staff keeping the buildings clean as the space grows. And of course our space is growing too because we've added buildings in the 2014 bond issue. So the space has grown some, although some of our space is more efficient space. For example, as we get rid of portables in this 2014 bond issue, and if we can pass the 2018 bond issue, it's more efficient space. And so it won't require some of the difficulties of going out to a portable and maintaining it, plus the high energy usage for portables. So it's kind of a more space, but more efficient space. Rob.
So one of the things that I'd say was a direct effect of what you'll see in these slides technology-wise is the same as what I would say what we're dealing with in the bond. You know, not passing a bond for 15 years, obviously you're going to have a huge amount of effort that needs to take place, and the same way would go with technology. In our district, this is about the number of devices that we have currently. Whenever you look at the number of devices that are over 4 years old, it's pretty significant. We've had to play catch up, and so the district hasn't ever had before this time a planned obsolescence for technology, and so it was basically based upon what the leadership at that building had looked at. There was a time when we applied for a TDP and borrowed some dollars. I want to say back in 2006, 2008 timeframe, and so that hadn't happened for 10 years. So you may walk into a building and see, devices that are 10 years old. And so what I'd ask you is, 10 years ago, there wasn't an iPhone. So how much has the world changed in that 10 years? Quite a bit. So this is what our kids experience in technology. you know, I have kids, 2 kids at the high school level now, and 1 at the university level. And so you can see that technology has changed our society quite a bit. How we engage with each other, how do we stay together, you know, via social media and other things. But you think yourself how, you know, you might use your phone to wake up in the morning, it's an alarm clock. You might think of how you order food or how you order a taxi or an Uber. Think of the Netflix. How many of you have Netflix? Raise your hand. Right? Most of us. So you see, technology has really changed how we take in things. And so we devised a planned obsolescence strategy aligned to the strategic plan, and everything goes back to that. Really looking at you know, a centrally aligned purchase. The lowest cost device that you could purchase before we started planned obsolescence was over $400. Now we're buying devices at a $220 mark that have a complete warranty for 4 years. That's even accidental warranty. So our cost that we're being able to take on has significantly lowered, and we're being able to do a lot more with that. So here's what has happened with that planned obsolescence. We started with secondary teachers and took the Houston Public Schools model. So we went with secondary teachers, and then we focused on secondary students. So initially, it was going to be a 4-year model of secondary staff, secondary students, elementary staff, and elementary students. Currently, we're in year 3, and we're still on secondary students. And I'd asked Dr. Talbot, you know, when are we slated to look at your building? Because we still haven't touched it. And I'd say probably sometime next year, which would be in year 4. And so knowing where we're at, we still haven't touched any of those 63 elementary schools yet. And when you look at testing or you look at formative assessments, if I'm relying on a 10-year-old device to supply an assessment that was just introduced to me this year, what type of experience is that kid going to get? So, yeah.
What's the difference in the number of units the general fund, this plan that you have, would provide versus what the bond provided?
So here's the difference. The bond, especially in Nebraska, can't provide devices. So we're relying solely on general fund and other things to provide those devices. We did apply for some grant funding, and I'd say Norris and Mars is getting one-to-one iPads via a digital promise grant. So we've looked at alternative models, but that's not something that's sustainable, right? You don't know that you're going to get those funds. And so when you look at digital curriculum or you look at the delivery of assessments, what we do today is do it in the classroom. And we no longer go with models of sending kids in this separate, you know, instance of going to test. It's usually now we try to test with the wireless environments that we have. Thank God we have the bond that has provided that wireless infrastructure to be able to do that in the classroom.
We'll dig some more into some of the technology too as it goes on, as you have more questions about what we need to be looking at.
Can I ask a question? I'd like to go back a few slides, not necessarily about technology, but with the staffing. And I'm kind of trying to figure this out. I see the 14 number is 4,873, and then I see this huge jump of FTE, almost 1,000. And I know that had to have an impact on some of what you're talking about, Rob. So I'm looking for an explanation of why that big jump.
What we did is we moved some staff. The SOPs moved out to the school buildings. So there were a bunch that were housed in central office that we moved out to the school buildings to serve the students there directly. And then we also, with our growth in students, our FTE grows also. So it's a combination of both of those things happening that we had that increase.
So do we know how many are new staff out of that number?
No, we don't, but we could put that on our parking lot if you'd like.
I'd like to
Okay.
see just growth, because I see the number flattens once we get to there.
We'll put that on for the list for next time.
would also indicate to you that, looking to see if Mr. Evans is in the room. This is when Mr. Evans came in the room, into your district. So all of a sudden, he moved people from what I would call the district office and those services there out into the classrooms, out into the buildings to help support the instruction more. That's a little bit of what was going on there too. So, okay. All right. Move on down here. Budget challenges. Okay, we're going to be looking at a bunch of numbers here and a bunch of challenges that you are facing. It's not going to be all of them, and the ones that we look at are going to change. Okay, because again, we're looking at estimates, projections, guesses at what's going to be coming at us in the next several months. Okay, so we're going to show you some numbers. Don't carve it in stone because it's going to change. Some by other people, some you will change or you will recommend the change, and so there'll be some things that happen. This is developing as it goes along. Then kind of in conjunction with that, the recommendations that you wind up giving to the board are going to need to provide some flexibility within that recommendation to allow them to make adjustments when it changes again before you adopt the budget. Because I don't know when we'll actually get a recommendation to the board, but the budget isn't finally adopted until end of August, September.
Yeah.
Okay, and I know from my experience in adopting budgets, it changes almost up until the last moment as we learn and know more about it. So to nail down to the penny is not something that will be easily carried through on. Okay, so we're going to look at the challenges.
Okay. This year we got an estimate from the state of Nebraska for our state aid. You know, I told you we got $288 million in state aid. When they gave us our estimate for 18-19, we're going to see an $11 million decrease in our state aid. So that was something I hadn't anticipated. I knew our student population was increasing, our needs are increasing, so I assumed that our state aid was going to increase also, and then I found out that it's not, and so we're adjusting to that also. And the reason our state aid is decreasing is because there was a bill passed in 2017 to help the state balance their budget. So they put restrictions on what schools could get for state aid, and what they did when we do the needs minus the resources, they increased the resources, decreased the needs so they could balance their budget. So they kind of passed it on down to the local districts, and then we pass that down to property taxes if we can, otherwise then we have to make cuts. So that's kind of how it works. It flows from the state down to the district, down to the taxpayer, and it's all kind of working together, but it happens whenever we're developing the budget. You project and you plan on things, but sometimes it doesn't come out the way you thought it would. So I don't know if we want to talk about the unfunded liability. We had a question last time when we met as the Budget Advisory Committee about why this got so big, why is this such a problem? And this is to show you this is one of our challenges. It's going to be a challenge from this point forward. It's a growing problem, and it's something that we need to address along with all of the other things that we do when we develop a budget. So in the budget that we're adopting for 18-19 that we're working on right now, trying to get developed, we know we have to come up with $15.9 million, $15.8 million just to pay for this, not counting everything else we have to pay for.
I guess the only thing I'd add to that, we are hoping that legislatively, there's an amendment right now. In fact, I know our board president testified yesterday at the legislative house there and talked about a pension obligation bond, which would reduce that. It's kind of complicated, but essentially it's a restructuring of debt, if I was to simplify it, kind of like refinancing your mortgage on your house. And that would help those numbers so they're not quite as steep. So there are some things that our district is working on to try to help with that unfunded liability. And essentially, the unfunded liability is caused when your investment earnings aren't enough with all the other contributions to pay for the retirees. And so that's what creates the unfunded liability. We dropped the assumption rate of our investment earnings from 8% to 7.5% last year. I believe that's right, isn't it, Don? Last year we went to 7.5% because we weren't meeting the 8%. And, you know, we've had some investments they didn't pan out like we obviously would like them to, and that happens sometimes. So investment earnings went down, but we think we're going to see some sunshine at the end of that. The Nebraska Investment Council now is the investment group of all of our OSERS money for all of us that belong to OSERS in here, like me and most of the people in the room, I guess. And so we see a better year this year, but that's always subject to change because you don't really know year to year exactly what's going to happen with investment earnings. So those numbers are based on today's actuarial charts, and there are some things that can impact it, but our attitude is we got to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And so we don't feel like we can stand back and say, well, it'll get better, and some of those investments that didn't work out, they'll go off the books, and better investments will go back in, and the unfunded liability will go down. I don't think you can budget that way. I think you've got to budget with the idea that we may have to have as much as those dollar amounts that are up there on that chart, which are pretty steep amounts for us in this room to come up with, but I think we have to be prepared for that. So we're hoping it can change, but right now that's what it looks like based on actuarial folks that give us those numbers.
So that is what Connie was talking about on the ARC payment?
Yes.
This year, the 12.9 that we had to dip into. reserves.
Exactly. That's exactly, that is the ARC payment. That's exactly.
There are additional payments on top of that.
Yeah, on top of that, we pay, like every employee pays 9.78% of their salary, and then the district matches that with 9.88% of whatever that employee paid. And then on top of that, the state puts in 2%. And then on top of that, because of the unfunded liability, we are now putting in that. And last year we put in $12 million. So yeah, that gives you, that's a great question. So that's kind of the big picture of that.
So that's been kind of historic. We've been kind of in this cycle. Is that what I'm kind of hearing, Connie?
The ARC payment?
Yeah.
Well, before they changed the assumptions and changed how they did the actuarial required contribution, ARC has always been there, but we weren't required to contribute more. Sometimes the district, if they had extra money left over,
got good return.
yeah, they would put more money into the retirement plan or something like that. But you know, with budget lids, levy lids, all that kind of thing, there's not extra money for the district to put into a pension fund just to put into it. So we do it when we're required to, and now we're required to contribute this growing number.
Kind of how we got into.
Well, it's the investment returns is how we.
Investment returns.
Yeah, yeah, I don't
Yeah,
know. if you're-
I'd say that's, I mean, MPERS, for example, which is what all other school districts in the state of Nebraska are covered by, they're at 80% funded. We're at 64%. Their investment returns have been much higher than ours. They're not paying an ARC. So, I mean, that's the biggest factor.
And the reason I asked, Mr. Evans, is I've heard people tell me we did not make a payment. But I'm hearing that differently now, that we have been making our required payment.
Yeah, I don't think there's any statutory payment that hasn't been made.
Okay.
I think is that accurate, Connie?
Yes.
The biggest factor is investment returns.
And the reason it's becoming a big issue for us now is we were at a legislative hearing yesterday with the retirement committee, and they're very concerned about our unfunded liability and that it's growing. And they want to make sure that we're doing something to address that. So it's in statute that we have to make the additional retirement contribution. There is a bill, an amendment to the bill that would let us do a pension obligation bond to try to smooth that out, make it something that's manageable, that I know what it is, and that it doesn't change all the time. And there's also there was an amendment introduced to change how we amortize the pension obligation. So there's a lot of factors that go into that, but we're trying to manage it with our general fund, which is capped at $1.05 maximum levy, plus everything else that we have to do as a school district. So we're not in the retirement business. We've never been in the retirement business, but it's coming into our general operations and it's affecting what we do for the schools and for the students that we serve. So it's what we do.
Other questions?
I have a question. Connie, if we put $15.9 million into a budget line to make that payment, okay, so we establish that budget there for next fiscal year, okay? In the next year, 2019 that's there, you've got an $18.5 million requirement. Is that additional budget authority, or is that just, are we going to have to increase the budget authority from the 15.9 to the 18.5?
We'd have to increase it from the 15.9 to the 18.5, but then we also have to balance it with all of our other things that we
Correct,
have.
yeah. But I think the point I want to try and make here is, this really looks nasty, okay? But if you don't fix it now, it gets worse, okay? If we can find the money to put $15.9 million into a budget line and leave it there and not decrease it, because next year, the obligation's 18.5. You've already got 15.9 of it there, you only got about $2.6 million to get up to that. So when I was in Wichita, we faced a huge problem with our health insurance. It was exactly the same thing. We didn't have enough reserves. We had to put $12 million into the reserves to get it to balance out, and then after that, it leveled itself out. So this is a big bite, but if you can get it done right, then it saves you down the road as we go.
Now, one thing to remember is all schools in the state of Nebraska have a retirement that they pay. It's a pension that the employees contribute and the employer contributes. We do the same thing, but we're the only ones that have our own retirement system. That's why we're responsible for funding this unfunded liability. All of the other school districts, all of their employees contribute to one fund for all of those schools. We don't have that, so that's why we have to pay for this ARC. And like Mark mentioned earlier, the state of Nebraska, for all the other teacher plans, they're 85% funded. We are 63% funded.
State of Kansas is at about 62% right now, too. They're in, well, yeah, lots of trouble.
And that's based on a 30-year amortization.
Yes, this is
You
based
just carried
on-
it out 5 years.
Right, and it's going to go more, but there's a difference in the state statute now. It has a 30-year open amortization period. That's what this is based on.
So
What?
23 could be
Yeah.
even more.
Could be even more, because one of the amendments that was introduced to the legislature was to change the amortization to a closed, I think it was 25-year or 27-year period, which will shoot that up, how much we have to pay. So we're just trying to make it, or, manage.
We got 5 years.
Well, no, not really. If they pass that law, we only have 1 year. So we may be back here looking at another 15 million or so to try to make that balance. Okay, so some of our challenges for next year is, even though we had an enrollment growth of 1,306 students from last year to this year, our funding stayed flat from the state. There was no increase. Actually, we had a decrease from the state. $6 million of the $11 million that we had in the reduction of our state aid had to do with our poverty allowance. We have 74% poverty in our school districts. That's free and reduced lunch. And our poverty allowance that the state gives us to fund our poverty programs that we do actually decreased by $6 million. So that was due largely because of a decrease in the number of students that are filling out the free lunch applications based on income. And one of the anomalies that we had that happened for the district is we started doing CEP for our schools. There's 6 schools that participate in the, what does CEP stand for? I can't remember.
Community eligibility plan.
Okay. So we have 6 schools that participate in that, and what that means is nobody has to fill out a free lunch application. Everybody gets to eat for free. but it's based on the student population and a percentage. They do some kind of calculation in the state aid formula. Well, we ended up on the short end of that because when a child is in a CEP school and they move to another school, that status doesn't follow with them. So if they do need free lunch, they're supposed to fill out an application so that we have the application for when they move. We didn't, our free lunch applications are trending down, so we're losing in that regard. And it affects our federal funding, it affects our state funding. It's a big deal for the district. So we need to get back to focusing on, we don't want to not feed children. We're not here to do that. We just need to be able to have them fill out free lunch apps if they qualify and if the parents are willing to do that, because it really is impacting our funding.
I'm going to editorialize a little bit here because in Wichita, we looked at this program also right at the very beginning and decided, the CEP program decided not to do it, mostly because of the loss of funding that we would incur. I have to say it's a great idea to be able to feed every kid in a building at no cost, but there is a cost. The way the program is set up, you get more federal reimbursement for nutrition services to help pay for that. But again, you remember, we can't use any of the money from nutrition services over on the general fund side except for indirect costs, which is limited by 1%. So it really helps and provides meals, but the impact is that form that they fill out to be qualified for free or reduced lunch is a federal form. It's used for title programs, it's used for E-rate programs, it's used for your at-risk standing, and it's one of those things where you start looking at the loss of revenue because they're not filling that out against what you're doing. You're going to have to come up with $6 million to be able to keep feeding those kids. And I know, yeah, it's a heartbreaking thing when you think about it. But at the same time, how many teachers is $6 million?
We get 18 teachers per $1 million.
Okay. So that sort of lays it out there. Okay, moving on.
Okay, another challenge that we have is textbook adoption. And right now, for a lot of our textbook adoptions, we're about 12 years behind schedule. And that's kicking the can down the road that we do sometimes is, maybe we can postpone a textbook adoption so that we can save a little bit of money to pay for this, but then we pay for it on the back end, so.
And just like Connie said, we have continuously kicked the can down the road to try to save money because we're always looking at money, but this year it's even a little bit more difficult. But what happens when we continue to kick the can down the road is our kids actually end up losing achievement. And so a lot of people are not aware that state statute requires that our State Board of Education adopt new standards every 7 years in the area of reading, writing, math, science, and social studies. And so what happens when they adopt new standards is the standards become much more rigorous. And so many of you are aware of what we've been calling the college and career ready standards. And what those standards did was take the level our students are expected to perform. So if you have a bell curve, majority of the people are in the middle of a bell curve. We have a small percentage on the left side, a small percentage on the right side. When we adopt new measurable standards, that whole bell curve is picked up and moved. The purpose is to support our community in becoming more intelligent, basically. And so when they adopt new standards, our current textbooks are no longer aligned. And when they're not aligned, our students are missing out. So for example, if you have a student who uses an aligned textbook, they score 1.1 standard deviation higher in achievement than a student who uses a misaligned textbook. They are a 0.15 lower standard deviation. That's a difference of a 0.25 standard deviation which accounts for 7 months of school. So each year we delay updating our textbooks to meet those new standards. Our kids miss out on 7 months of schooling. And so we've kicked the can down the road for a reading adoption in elementary for 10 years. So we have not just gone through one 7-year cycle, but now we've just hit a second set of 7-year cycle. And so when the students were tested last spring on those new standards, much more rigorous, you saw a drop of approximately 77% of our students mastering the standard, dropping to 35%. It's because of the new standards. It's not because our kids aren't intelligent. It's not because they're not doing good work. It's not because our teachers and principals are not doing good work. It's the standards are that much more difficult. And so if there's a drop from 76 to 35%, that's a huge difference in the level of difficulty of materials that are needed in the hands of our students. And unfortunately, the elementary reading adoption is the most expensive because the students have more materials and the teaching materials, there's just many more things that you need to teach our students in reading. So Rob, why don't you go ahead and scroll down. So what happens is the Nebraska Department of Education develops a standards revision timeline. And so every 7 years, they have to adopt new standards. Then they give districts 1 year to adopt those standards or to adopt standards that are much more rigorous. And so, for example, last May, the Board of Education at the state level adopted new science standards. So we have 1 year to adopt new science standards in the Omaha Public Schools. So in the month of March or April, the science team will be going to the Board of Education, asking them to adopt our new standards. And so we have to keep up with this pace. We have to with reading, writing, math, science, and social studies, but that doesn't even include all the other subject areas that we teach that are also listed down there. And so it just, like Connie said, it just gets more difficult the longer we wait.
So Melissa, how far are we behind?
In which subject?
Subjects. So
Oh.
I've heard reading.
So reading, we haven't had a new reading adoption in elementary for about 10 years.
Okay.
Here's an example. We're purchasing some ACP materials this year, which is about $250,000. We've never had an adoption until this year. We've always just done little supplemental type things. And so usually you're behind. That's just the way it works.
So core, let's do math, are we behind adoption-wise?
So math, the current adoption is a Common Core. And so when the new math standards were implemented this year, they do align. So we got lucky with math. We did an ELA adoption this year for 6th grade through 12th grade. We did a writing for elementary last year. We have not done social studies in 15 years. So that's going to become an issue when we build more schools with the bond because we have to purchase materials, and a lot of those materials cannot be purchased any longer.
And correct me if I'm wrong, most of these have a technology
Yes.
component that we're not ready, according to Mr. Dixon, to be able to use.
Yes, that does come into play. So one of the things that Rob and my department did this year was we built in a technology component into our textbook adoption cycle, so that we're working on that together.
The core, we're behind, is kind of what I'm hearing.
Yes.
In certain areas, we're okay, in some other areas.
Yes.
Like I said before, we having fun yet? Let me tell you that you kind of go, whoa. Every school district faces this all the time. Textbook adoption is one of those things that I I've worked in 9 different school districts. I don't know of any of those school districts that could ever keep up. Just because of the way the funding cycle has to work and that sort of thing. So but again, this is another one of those that, yeah, you do have a choice. You could choose not to do that, not to find $10 million somewhere else in the budget to be able to fund this. Okay, but you run it, and we'll talk about this down the road, about what are the consequences. What is going to be the impact on those students? You've already heard what happens with achievement scores. It doesn't mean the kids aren't learning something. It's just that they're not at the level that the state is saying that they need to be at. So that's in, Kansas has gone through the same things. You're not alone in this. Okay, it is 7:05. We are going to take a break. You got 10 minutes from now. Go.
Vice President of Finance. Yeah, I had another engagement I had to get to. Yeah. Yeah, they're great for chairing that sort of thing. Hey. Go look at it ahead of me. So where it's at. That's the thing out. That's why we're talking. When we get talking to see because she might have another idea too. Then they can have that money. If you want to pay for the health insurance, have a health insurance. so guaranteed this year is not, next year will be. How can you do this? Don't ask for changes. But you have to say, how can we put this also employees that have insurance for services, which is part of the contract, but not have to say that's a big deal. How much taxes would we do? The contract doesn't just because you separate the service. The contract is and you have to make that. Their contract is not in. Actually, negotiations may be over earlier next year. Maybe you only got 6 months. There's gotta be a way to make that better. So when you recommend? I started the other every other year he's the chair of that board. And this year, it says you're all, but he's in that process. I think he might be able to get me across the shoot. Nobody's going to get BS. You're a judge, you can go BS at the table. Yeah. You got that's the reason you have broad shoulders. Like the old question is on why is it that all lawyers when they ask a question, they go, until the answer. You snuck in and tried to sneak out.
It wasn't my intention. I saw Mark Snow. I had to talk to Mark.
Except at home when I can sit on the couch. Yeah. Which I'm no, I misstepped going down my stairs.
That's what they say. That's what you got to go.
I got a month plus to go. That's assuming that it actually starts to scale in. We don't have to go down the survey.
I'd ring my bell, but I don't have it. It's 10 minutes is up. Time to get back to class now. Tardy bell is rung. So it looks like I'm going to have to send some principals to the office. No, not yet. She's got some more to do. So, yeah.
How you doing, man?
All right, we're going to continue on with some of our challenges. As soon as Connie gets wired up here, I'll let her talk. Okay, here we go.
Okay, we talked earlier about the things we did to make the budget balance, and we reduced technology and we reduced the textbook adoption just to get our budget to balance. Now it's coming back at us, and we need to do something about a textbook adoption so that we can take care of our students. We also have 11 bargaining units that are part of OPS system. So we've negotiated with the bargaining units, settled with them, and tentatively it's going to be about a $7 million increase overall in salaries for the staff in the different bargaining units. So, the bargaining units have been understanding of our budget situation, and we're doing everything we can to help balance the budget. Another challenge I have is we talked a little bit about Title II. Title II was used for class size reduction, and I think it's with ESSA that they changed it that we can't use it for class size reduction. So now the 30 teachers that we moved over to Title II have to now move back over to the general fund. So we got $10 million in textbook adoptions, we got our salary increases, then we have $2 million that we have to move back into the general fund. That wasn't there before. So of that $505 million, now we're moving this stuff back in because of changes in federal law. So those are some challenges that we have. Like we said before, the unrestricted money available to the district is $505 million. Then we know we have these challenges that are coming up, and those challenges add up to be $51.9 million. So when we talk about reallocation, what we're doing is we're still going to spend the same amount of money, but we're going to spend it on different things. I don't know if you want to...
Yeah. I'll take over now. Let me trade you. Hang on to that. Ooh. Okay. Can you hear me? All right. Yeah, it's kind of a daunting thing to think about that much that has to be reallocated within the budget. 10.2%, 10%. And but again, these are ballpark numbers, estimates, and we'll work through this, and maybe we can get that 51.9 down. Okay, in terms of some of the recommendations or some of the things that you might be able to come up with that might help us, or other things, okay? Because that's where we're going to go next, okay? And we're going to we've got 50 minutes, okay? And in that 50 minutes, we're going to talk about these 4 questions, and then just in general, other ideas and things. You're going to start giving us the direction that we need to have to provide you with the information and the data that you can make good decisions about the recommendations. I learned early on in my career as a business official, back in actually even before that, in the late 80s, that the best decisions are data-driven decisions. We hear that a lot, okay? And so we need to know what data you need to hear about and to learn, and what you need to learn about departments and that sort of thing as well. So that's part of this discussion, okay? So, and these are questions that I just came up, they're kind of general type questions. Are there any challenges that can be set aside or changed, okay? You've got the PowerPoint, you can look and see what those challenges are. Is there anything there that we might want to investigate to see if we could impact that $51.9 million? Okay, you could simply say, we don't want to do the textbook adoption. Okay, so, but you've heard some of that. That's one reason why I had Rob and Melissa talk a little bit this time, because there are two big pieces in there that come into play. So I want you to just, I'm going to give your table time to discuss this. I want somebody at the table to be a record keeper, okay, and I'll give you some time, and then we'll report out kind of on each one of these, but you can discuss them all at the same time, because some of them kind of tie together and lead one to the other place. So that's the first one. Second one is, should an across-the-board 10% reduction be considered? In other words, we take that $505 million that we have sitting out there in unrestricted, and we just take every budget line that uses that and cut 10% off of it. Okay? That includes salaries and benefits. So, should we take, that would solve the problem right there. Should we take a 10% reduction across the board? Okay? That'd be 51 million. Should we look at separating the personnel budgets from the non-personnel budgets? Okay? And these two kind of tie together a little bit. Okay, I'm going to use Rob's budget as an example. You know, he's got a $2 billion budget sitting out here, and you know, that's his whole budget. Okay, but $1.9 billion of that is personnel, and the other part of it is stuff. Okay, now those are incredibly off numbers, but I guess the question really here is, do you want to start talking about people to make this happen?
I'm sorry. I think it gets at it to a point, but I almost wonder if we shouldn't be talking about what are our philosophical priorities in terms of funding the district. So I don't know if that gets us far enough along.
Yeah, I think that's why I wanted to have plenty of time for discussion, because those are the kind of things we need to start talking about. I'm just trying to drive you a little bit in that direction, but yes, you're absolutely right. Okay, and the last one is, what parts of the budget should we look at more closely? I guess I should say, what parts of the budget should we look at? We haven't really looked at very much of anything in the budget yet, but I kind of given you a little bit of an overview of what's there, okay? So you've got those four things, but don't limit your discussions to just these, okay? But I do want to have some feedback on these particular items, okay? So it's about 7:23. I'm going to give you, yeah.
So I want to go back real quick to the 51.9, Connie, so I'm going to put you on the spot so I'm clear. 16 is pension, 15.9. 11 is TIOSA, or state reduction in funding. Is that correct? 10 is 10 million in textbook adoption. 7 is predicted salary increases. 2 million is in the Title II movement, that those staff will be coming back. 6 is in the poverty reduction.
That's part of TIOSA.
That's part of TIOSA, so that's 6 million in regards to the lunch.
Well, then
That's part of the 11.
then that's my mistake in the math.
So it may be not 51.9.
Yeah, take 6 million off of that.
I've done my job.
Okay,
So
6 million.
I'm missing 12 somewhere in here.
Here's 11.
I got that one.
Here's 15.9.
Got that. That's 26.9.
Take that one off. Here's 10.
That's 36.9.
7.
43.9,
2.
45.9.
Okay?
So that'd be right. Okay, all right. So I just have an extra 12 in there.
Yeah, and that is my fault.
it's all good. I
Because
just wanna make sure.
I'm living in a Kansas world and not an Omaha world, so I'm learning as I go too. So anyway, but say, hey, we've already done something to reduce our problem there.
Real quick, we talk about data. So before we get in these groups, I'm curious, in the for-profit world, if you're going to look at stuff like this, you're going to look at industry statistics, maybe lay yourself out to what the rest of the world looks like. Is there something like that for school districts?
Well, in some areas, yes. We have a lot of data about how the school district operates, I'm sure. I don't know whether they've done any studies here, HR studies or anything. Charles, have you done any kind of comparative things?
There's no like,
Okay. All right, so I'm assuming there is some of that data available. So as we start looking at things, if that's what you want to look at, if you want to look at comparative data to industry standards, then we'll try and dig that data up.
so one might be classroom per teacher, students per teacher.
Now, one thing when you're looking at that though is demographics are different between districts. What we have for our demographics is different than what, another school district may have. So when you're comparing OPS to pretty much any school district in Nebraska, we're different than they are. But you could compare us to maybe Des Moines or Council Bluffs or something like that nationally.
Like a national, all school districts of a certain size. If it was a for-profit company, you'd look at company revenues between X and Y, and you'd find similar companies, and you'd look at statistics, and then you'd see where you have outliers, and then you'd look, why is this one higher than the average? And maybe there's a good reason for it, and maybe that's a good place to start on.
The other thing that's different too is in other states, they have different funding formulas. How they fund a school district looks different than how they fund it here. So you need to, they may want to spend more or do spend more, but it could be because of how their funding is structured. So those are kind of nuances that we have to consider too.
Understood. I think it's more just if you have a big group, you're not just looking at Des Moines or one place, you got them all together, and it's a starting point. It's not necessarily going to be your answer, but it's a place to start looking as to maybe where we have an issue or a place where we can do something.
And so as we go through these discussions, make sure that your group or whatever gets that written down so that we will take a look at that. We're just going to come up with a long list of stuff that put them to work and see what we can find out as we go through this. So it is 7:20.
There's a 2013 annual survey of school system finances that looks at all public schools and what's spent by state, by category of spending. So it's a little bit stale, but it'll give an idea of what states spend and what they spend it on for public schools.
So we can provide that information, but there is some data out there to address some of those. But you're not going to find correlations to the corporate business world directly, but you are going to be able to compare some other things too. So we'll try and pull some of that data together. Okay, 7:28. I'm going to give you 15 minutes of discussion time. Well, we already talked about a bunch of it. You got, and I'm going to give you 15 minutes, and then then I'll give you some more. I'll kind of touch base with you and see where you are after 15 minutes. So 15 minutes and talk about these things and start writing some things down of what you would like for us to work on.
I mean, not all of it. Well, I'm doing it, no, we don't want to say tax, because if you're looking at some of these things, probably, I mean, this is. I don't see, I mean, you got, you have to, you look at that tax administration, 17, that is basically. It's their goal, retirees and this revised budget. Or even in, now go back and, you know, say, outside list. We have to pay for that. I mean, that's that one, yeah. It's geared into. How you do it is, you're either gonna have, first, you're gonna don't have that kind of stuff. They provide, this was fun, so they won't provide everything. But this is not something and that might be something, like, if we can't do this, if we attempt to do something else. Typically, it has not that kind of special. Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to make a quick check of where you are. It's about a quarter till right now. I do want to give you a little bit more time, but I want to have time to report out. So you think you can kind of wrap up your discussions in another 5 minutes so that we can have 10 minutes to report out? Will that work? 5 more minutes, and then we start reporting out. Okay, we're about ready to debrief now.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand.
We budget an average salary
Okay, what I'd like to do, I hope you have written down things that you can give to us so that we can start our research process. That's what I'm aiming for. I'm not going to write a bunch of stuff down up here, so I'm hoping that either on the cards or on some paper or something you've recorded this. So we're going to go from table to table and ask someone or multiple people at a table to talk about what these 4 questions, if you don't have to address every single one of them, but if there's one of them or something that you really want to talk about and say we need to do this or don't need this or whatever, that's fine. And then what is it that you need for us to start bringing back to you in terms of more data, more research, more areas to concentrate on? Because I don't want to waste the time of the financial staff and the research staff and everything here if it's something that you're not interested in. So I'm not going to try and guess that. I'll probably have a pretty good idea, but I'll let you tell me what we need to do. So start with this table right over here.
Okay, for the first one, are there any challenges that can be set aside or changed? We think the getting the free and reduced lunch forms and focusing on that is really important, and if we can get those in and impact the money coming in, that would be a critical, easy thing to change, possibly, although we don't know the full story on that. Across the board, 10% reductions. We don't want to see that. We think looking at each expenditure makes more sense than going across the board. With regards to the third question, should we look at personnel separate from non-personnel budgets? Our thought was to look at them in a different light, keeping in mind that personnel is somebody's job, but that there are things we need to look at in both categories. And then 4, what parts of the budget should we look at more closely? We had a big discussion on looking at retirement and how that's working, and potentially having part-time involved in funding the retirement. We didn't know if that would make sense, if the payments coming out for part-time would equate to a timing change that would help. The second big piece that we started talking about was transportation, and looking at transportation again on whether it's working efficiently and whether we're spending too much on transportation and where that could be cut.
Okay.
We also thought that it was really important to take a step back and look at priorities and have that discussion about priorities. As a parent, I think a priority should be educating our students in the basic subjects of reading, writing, math, science, social studies. I'm not a teacher, so whatever those basic things are, needs to be a priority and a laser focus, but that we should have a discussion as a group as to what the priorities should be before we get too far down the road.
And if you've talked about it and have similar responses, we don't need to say the same thing over and over again. So if you got something new or want to add to something that was said, or did your reporter leave you?
He sure did. And he on the school board. Where'd he go? Are there any challenges that can be set aside or changed? You know what our response to that was? The challenges are why we're here. So I don't know if you can set aside any of them. But they all need to be looked at. I think one of the things we discussed the most was the textbooks and the $10 million at the elementary level. Is there something that we can do to help support that textbook fee, although we may not have to get them all at once, that kind of thing, and spacing it out. Obviously, we disagree with cutting across the board 10% because there are some things that would get hit worse than others, and that's not necessary. Should we separate personnel budgets from non-personnel budgets? I think you always have to look at that. I think it's a natural look when that happens. But out of that conversation, we talked about privatizing some of the things that we do within our school district. But then when you do that, The other part of that story is then where does that contribution to the pension fund go and all that stuff. So there's things that we could look at there that could talk about. And then what parts of the budget should we look at more closely? Transportation was one of the things that we said as well. But one of the things we wanted to make sure we protect is that we're protecting the classroom and protecting the teachers, and hope that we wouldn't hit there first.
This table said basically what you've heard already, so I'm not going to repeat it, and we pretty much agree with the group so far. As far as transportation, again, transportation, but looking at the mileage requirements that kids would get transportation. And then there was some discussion about putting all grade levels on a bus instead of separating them, elementary, middle, high. That's kind of thinking outside the box. We question whether textbooks mean regular textbooks or electronic, and are electronic cheaper? We're not quite sure about that. I don't know. And also, what would the amount be if we didn't replace any of those personnel that retired or left the district, by attrition? What would that save? That's our question.
I think all of ours are the same that have already been stated. One of the things that we choose, I think, some words differently, but what are all the different programs that exist? The table back here talked about going back to some core basic subjects, but if we did have an idea of what existed, could we prioritize, and then how could we save money that way? And that would also lead to personnel. We talked about people are the most expensive. You hate to lose people, but it's also the fastest way to make up dollars.
Many of the things that were discussed at our table have already been mentioned. We talked about looking at contracted services and the opportunity to renegotiate some of those costs that potentially possible. We also talked about the broad philosophical view of keeping the cuts away from the classroom and school buildings to the greatest extent possible. We also had concerns about an across-the-board sweep of around 10%. Were there any data points we talked about? I believe so. I peppered them with some data, but otherwise I think we're pretty good with data over here. Thanks.
So we talked about the challenges, and that the challenges that were given to us tonight, none of those can really be taken out of the budget or changed other than textbooks. I did pose a question to my team here that how many teachers use textbooks, and maybe that's something that we need to ask before we spend $10 million on it. And would they rather have those textbooks as books, or would they rather have it digital? What would work best? What would be most cost effective? Did you ask who doesn't use textbooks? Oh. Yeah, you have to have computers. One of the other things we talked about is that what is the philosophy of Omaha Public Schools, and what are our priorities? So what do we want to see? Where do we want to see our district going? So taking a look at our magnet schools and academy schools that have smaller class sizes and cost more, is that something we want to keep going? Also, we thought that general cuts at the beginning should be made at TAC, where it would look better public perception. And when we're going with a bond to get voted on, that's something that the public has to vote on. And moving people, like, are there people at TAC that are certified teachers that we may need to move back into buildings? Would that help alleviate cost?
think most everything was covered. Going down your list, challenges that can be set aside. Obviously, the textbook thing, kind of like everybody else came up. I mean, nobody wants to do that, but that might be something that can be at least delayed. The 10% reduction across the board. I mean, 10% is probably just an unreasonable. It's unreasonable to consider that. But you get through this whole process, cutting what you can, specific areas, and you get down to it, and you're still short. And across the board, cut of a smaller percentage might be what you're left with. You may not have a choice. One thing that I personally, I'm an outsider, I don't know what some of this stuff means. So the department descriptions, I was asking them a whole bunch of questions as to what this stuff is. Maybe looking at what more information we need, or what do we need to look at more closely, would be what all these departments are, what they do. I'm back to the benchmarking soapbox of, do other similar sized districts have all the same stuff? Do we have something maybe we don't need? I don't have any idea. I don't even know what most of the stuff means. So a lot of you that work here do, but I think there's a bunch of people here that aren't in the school district that don't know what this stuff is, so it's hard to even know where to start. So some education on what these departments are would be great.
Somebody that has access to it.
And I think the whole question about separating the teachers or the personnel from the rest of it, I think that would definitely be helpful. Our group thinks it would be helpful. I think that's all we got. One general question, though, I think I understand, is that if you look back on these schedules, you get $20 million per year the last 3 years. Roughly 3.5–4% of the budget wasn't spent each of those 3 years. Is that correct? Okay, just want to make sure I understood that right.
We'll let one of you guys pay the bills when there's no cash in the bank to do that.
Well, it sounds like we had a lot of thoughtful discussion, and I really appreciate that, because the one thing that we chatted about was kind of some internal operations in regards to the challenges. The CEP schools probably need to be investigated. I think that got brought up. Obviously, transportation, student-teacher ratios. Historically, that's been a model, and I don't know what our district is. I know that varies by building, but that also ties into Magnet, it ties to Focus, it ties into a number of theme schools that for a long time probably haven't been evaluated and reviewed for effectiveness as well as cost efficiency. We talked a little bit about paras, whether they were necessary. It sounds like most paras are at the elementary level, according to Mr. Aranda, but special ed has got some of that. So in essence, that conversation may have morphed into, what about non-teaching personnel in the building? And that kind of maybe ties into TAC as well. So in regards to a 10% reduction being considered, I agree. I think you do what you can, but the one thing that I will keep everybody's focused on, this is this year. This will be again next year. And you saw what the ARC payment does. It goes up again and again, and you can cut the non-personnel, but eventually you become a district of 95 personnel expenditures and 5%. It's got to happen somewhere. And so, so when we talk about separating those budgets, it becomes kind of difficult. And I agree with the discussion that we just heard from the last table, that it probably is time to have a full audit of who we are, what we want to be, and are we meeting those goals. I agree with Pastor Allen when he talked about what is our philosophy. And we have been somebody, anybody to everybody, and eventually you kind of got to get yourself focused. So.
Well, we're not too far past 8 o'clock. And that's really all I've got. This is opportunity. We just did all of this. Next meeting is scheduled for Thursday, March 22nd. Okay? That's the week after spring break. All right? And so put that on your calendars. I think they sent invites out, whatever. So we'll try and remind you about that. I want you also to think about, consider the possibility of needing to have 2 meetings in April. Okay, so give that some thought, and we'll try and gather some information back and feedback and kind of look at potential there, because I think we're starting to starting to gather some momentum now and what we need to really start talking about. Everything that you discussed and wrote down or whatever, I want to make sure that we get here in writing so that we can create a list and start working on that. And I have to say that I've done this a lot of times in a lot of different districts, and you're coming up with exactly the same thing that everybody else does all the time. Okay? There is no magic. There is no magic. It's a matter of digging into the data, finding the places where you can become more efficient or do things better and saving some money and not impacting the classroom. It really is kind of what it comes down to. So thank you all very much. I appreciate your participation and look forward to the next session. See you on the
We'll post this
22nd.
presentation on the website tomorrow, but last month's is there already, so